The cold wind of Kepler 442c swept across the military base as 5 young alien soldiers gathered around the blue flames of a plasma fire. The small moon orbited a distant star, far from their home worlds, and the night brought an icy chill that cut through even their thick uniforms. Above them, the gas giant they orbited cast strange shadows across the rocky ground. Commander Zethkar walked slowly toward the fire, his metal leg making soft clicking sounds with each step. The cybernetic limb was a reminder of battles fought, long ago, in wars that happened before these young soldiers were even born. His 3 good arms moved stiffly, and the scars across his blue-gray skin told stories of plasma burns and blade cuts from a dozen different conflicts. The 5 recruits looked up as their commander approached. There was Vex, a thin creature with 4 eyes that blinked in sequence. Next to him sat Kira, whose green skin changed color when she was nervous. Jorak flexed his powerful arms, proud of his strength but still new to real combat. Tess had wings, folded against her back, and her people were known for their speed in battle. Finally, there was Nam, the youngest of them all, whose people had only joined the Galactic Defense Corps 2 years ago. "Commander," Vex spoke first, his voice high and eager. "We heard you fought in the Zephyrian Wars. Tell us about the great battles." Zethkar settled his large frame onto a metal crate near the fire. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and rough, like rocks grinding together. "You want to hear war stories," he said. It was not a question. "You think war is glorious. You think it is about honor and courage and victory parades." Kira's skin shifted to a pale yellow, a sign of confusion among her people. "Is it not, Commander?" The old soldier shook his head slowly. "War is many things, young one. But the stories that keep me awake at night are not about our people. They are not about Zephyrian plasma weapons or Corvin battlecruisers or even the great siege of Proxima Station." He paused, looking at each of the recruits in turn. "The stories that truly frighten me are about our allies, about the humans." Jorak laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Humans? Commander, they are our friends now. They helped us defeat the Dominion fleet just last year. They are small and soft and have no natural weapons." "No natural weapons," Zethkar repeated, and something in his voice made the laughter die in Jorak's throat. "That is what I thought too before I studied their military history, before I learned what they are capable of when they decide to make war." The wind picked up, making the plasma fire flicker. Somewhere in the distance they could hear human voices from the base, laughing and talking as they shared their evening meal. The sounds seemed normal, even comforting. 3 years ago, Zethkar continued, when the Alliance was first formed, I was assigned to study human warfare. Command wanted to know how these small, weak creatures had managed to survive and thrive on their violent world. They wanted to understand how humans could be useful allies. Tess folded her wings tighter against the cold. "What did you find, Commander?" "I found that humans do not fight like any other species in the galaxy. They do not follow the normal rules of warfare. They do not know when to give up. They do not understand the concept of acceptable losses." His voice grew quieter. "They fight with a kind of madness that makes them the most dangerous creatures I have ever encountered." Nam, the youngest, spoke up. "But Commander, they seem so peaceful. The humans on our base are kind. They share their food with us. They help us with our equipment. They tell jokes and play games." "Yes," Zethkar nodded. "That is what makes them so terrifying. They can be the kindest, most generous beings in the universe. They will risk their lives to save a stranger. They will give their last meal to someone who is hungry. They will adopt the young of other species and raise them as their own." He looked directly at Nam. "But when they decide that something must be destroyed, when they choose to make war, they become something else entirely. Something that does not belong in a civilized galaxy." The recruits exchanged glances. Vex's 4 eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of nervousness. "What do you mean, Commander?" Zethkar stood up and walked to the edge of their small circle. Beyond the firelight, the base stretched out in all directions, its lights twinkling in the darkness. Human and alien soldiers worked together, patrolling the perimeter and maintaining their equipment. I mean that human warfare is not about honor, or glory, or even survival. It is about winning no matter the cost. They will sacrifice anything, including their own humanity, to achieve victory. They will turn their greatest strengths into weapons. They will use their compassion as a tool of war. They will make their enemies afraid to sleep, afraid to eat, afraid to trust their own shadows. He turned back to face them. I have studied the records of their wars. I have read the reports of battles fought on their home world. I have interviewed human veterans who lived through conflicts that would have broken the spirit of any other species. Kira's skin had turned a deep purple, the color of fear among her people. Surely you exaggerate, Commander. Do I? Sethkar asked. Let me tell you about the humans I have studied, about the medic who used his knowledge of healing to create the perfect weapons, about the sergeant who held a position for 6 weeks when she was ordered to hold it for 1 day, about the naval officer who turned an entire space station into a haunted house, about the colonel who transformed his own soldiers into something beyond human recognition. The wind died down, and the only sounds were the crackling of the plasma, fire, and the distant hum of the base's generators. The recruits sat in silence, waiting. These are not legends or myths, Sethkar continued. These are documented historical events. These are the actions of ordinary humans who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. And in each case, they chose to do things that no other species would even consider. Jorak flexed his arms, nervously. But they are our allies now. They fight beside us. Yes, the commander agreed. And we should be grateful for that. Because I have learned one important truth about humans in all my studies. He paused, letting his words sink in. They are absolutely loyal to their friends and absolutely merciless to their enemies. There is no middle ground with them. You are either someone they will die for or someone they will destroy completely. Tess spread her wings slightly, then folded them again. You speak as if you fear them, Commander. I do fear them, Sethkar admitted without shame. Any intelligent being should fear humans, not because they are evil, but because they are capable of anything when they believe their cause is just. They do not have the limitations that control the rest of us. They do not know when to stop. He sat back down, his metal leg creaking slightly. Tonight I will tell you 5 stories about human warfare. They are true stories taken from their own historical records. I tell them not to frighten you, but to help you understand what kind of allies we have gained. The plasma fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows across their faces. In the distance, a human patrol was returning to base, their voices carrying across the cold air as they joked with each other. Remember as you listen, Sethkar said, that these same humans who are capable of such terrible things are the ones who share their rations with us when supplies run low. They are the ones who risk their lives to save wounded aliens. They barely know. They are the ones who teach our children their games and tell them stories to help them sleep. He looked at each recruit one final time. That is what makes them so dangerous, and that is why we must never, ever give them reason to consider us enemies. The fire crackled and the night grew colder as Commander Sethkar prepared to tell his first story. Commander Sethkar stared into the blue flames for a long moment, his scarred face reflecting the dancing light. The 5 young recruits waited in silence, the cold wind of the alien moon making them pull their uniforms tighter around their bodies. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet they had to lean forward to hear him. The first story I will tell you happened on Earth in the year 2045. Humans were fighting other humans, as they often did before they learned to reach the stars. It was a conflict over resources, over territory, over ideas that seem small now, but meant everything to them then. Vex shifted nervously, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. Commander, if they were fighting each other, how is this different from any other war? The old soldier looked at him with something that might have been pity. Because, young one, even when humans fight their own kind, they do things that would terrify any alien species. This story is about a human named Jake Murphy. He was what they call a medic. Kira's green skin brightened slightly. A healer, like our medical corps? Yes and no, Sethkar replied. Human medics are trained to save lives, to heal wounds, to bring comfort to the dying. Jake Murphy was very good at his job. His fellow soldiers loved him because he had saved many of their lives. He was known for being gentle, kind, always willing to help anyone who was hurt. The commander paused, letting his metal fingers drum against the crate he sat on. Murphy worked at what humans call a field hospital. It was a place where wounded soldiers were brought to be healed. It was marked with a red cross, a symbol that was supposed to mean it was safe, that it would not be attacked. Tess folded her wings tighter. Supposed to mean? The enemy forces decided that the hospital was helping too many of their opponents survive, so they targeted it with artillery fire. They destroyed the building, killed the patients, killed the other medics. Zethkar's voice became harder. Jake Murphy was one of only 3 survivors. Nam, the youngest recruit, made a soft sound of sympathy. That is terrible, Commander, but such things happen in war. What happened next, Zethkar continued, is what makes this story worth telling. Most soldiers who survive such an attack would try to retreat to find their own forces to report what happened. Some might seek revenge through direct combat. Jake Murphy did neither of these things. The wind picked up again, making the plasma fire flicker and cast strange shadows across their faces. In the distance, they could still hear human voices from the base, but now those sounds seemed somehow different, less comforting than before. Murphy spent the next 3 days studying his enemies. He watched their patrols, learned their routines, identified their supply lines. He discovered where they got their water, where they stored their food, where they kept their medical supplies, and then he began to use his medical knowledge in ways it was never meant to be used. Jorak flexed his powerful arms. He poisoned them. Not exactly, Zethkar said. Poison is crude, obvious. What Murphy did was far more sophisticated. He contaminated their water supply with bacteria that would cause severe stomach illness. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to make grown soldiers too sick to fight. The recruits exchanged glances. This did not sound particularly frightening yet. But that was only the beginning, the commander continued. Murphy had spent years learning how to calculate exact doses of medicine. He knew exactly how much of each drug a human body could handle. So when he sabotaged their medical supplies, he did not simply destroy them. He altered them. Kira's skin began to shift toward a nervous yellow. Altered them how? Pain medication that would work for a few hours, then cause terrible headaches. Antibiotics that would seem to work at first, then fail when they were needed most. Surgical instruments that had been treated with chemicals that would cause infections. Every piece of medical equipment that might save a life was turned into something that would cause more suffering. The fire crackled, and Vex made a small, whimpering sound. Among his people, medical supplies were sacred, never to be tampered with even in the worst conflicts. The enemy force consisted of 200 soldiers, Zethkar said. Within 3 days, over half of them were too sick to fight. The rest were caring for their comrades, trying to figure out what was making everyone ill. They sent out search parties to find clean water. They radioed for medical supplies to be dropped from aircraft. Tess spread her wings slightly, then folded them again. And Murphy? Murphy intercepted their radio communications. He was trained in field medicine, which included emergency communications. He sent false messages, giving incorrect coordinates for supply drops. He caused their relief supplies to be dropped in enemy territory, where Murphy's own forces could capture them. The commander stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight. But the most terrifying part was not what Murphy did to their supplies. It was what he did to their minds. Their minds? Nam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Murphy began leaving evidence of his presence, but never showing himself. A medical kit would disappear from one tent and appear in another, with some items missing and others added. Soldiers would wake up to find their bandages had been changed in the night, but changed incorrectly, causing their wounds to become infected. Zethkar turned back to face them, his cybernetic eye glowing softly in the firelight. The enemy soldiers began to fear their own medical supplies. They became afraid to eat their food, afraid to drink their water, afraid to treat their wounds. They began to suspect each other, wondering if one of their own comrades was the saboteur. Kira's skin had turned a deep purple. But surely they tried to find him. They did. They sent out patrols, set up ambushes, searched every possible hiding place. But Murphy had been trained to work in combat zones. He knew how to move without being seen, how to hide in places where normal soldiers would never think to look. And every time they searched for him, he was somewhere else, contaminating something new. The old soldier sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. By the end of the third day, the enemy force had been reduced from 200 effective soldiers to 30. Not through battle, not through heroic charges or clever tactics, but through one medic who decided to stop healing and start hurting. Jorak's voice was shaky when he spoke. What happened to Murphy? His own forces found him on the fourth day. He had been walking back toward their lines, carrying a medical kit he had recovered from the destroyed hospital. When they asked him what he had been doing for 3 days, he simply said he had been practicing medicine. The recruits sat in stunned silence. The idea of using medical knowledge as a weapon was beyond their understanding. In every civilized species, healers were protected, their knowledge considered sacred. The enemy force surrendered 2 days later, Zethkar continued, not because they had been defeated in battle, but because they were too afraid to continue fighting. They requested that Murphy be assigned to a different sector, as far away from them as possible. Vex's 4 eyes were wide with shock. But, Commander, that is not honorable combat. That is not how civilized beings fight wars. Exactly, Zethkar nodded. That is what I have been trying to tell you. Humans do not fight like civilized beings. They fight to win, and they will use any knowledge, any skill, any advantage they can find. He looked at each of them in turn. Jake Murphy was not a monster. After the war, he returned to civilian life and became a doctor. He spent the rest of his career saving lives, treating patients, training other medics. He was known for his kindness and his skill. Nam shook his head in confusion. How can the same person be both a healer and what he became during those 3 days? That, Zethkar said, is what makes humans so dangerous. They can transform themselves when necessary. They can take their greatest strengths and turn them into terrible weapons. Murphy's knowledge of medicine made him an excellent healer. But when his hospital was destroyed, when his patients and colleagues were killed, that same knowledge made him something else entirely. The plasma fire burned lower, and the cold seemed to seep deeper into their bones. The human voices from the base had grown quieter as the night deepened. Remember this story, the commander said. Remember that the humans who work alongside us, who share their food and their jokes and their friendship, possess this same capacity for transformation. They are not evil, but they are capable of acts that would break the spirits of any other species. He stood up again, preparing to add more fuel to the fire, and we have only just begun. The next story I will tell you is about a human soldier who was ordered to hold a position for 1 day. She held it for 6 weeks. The recruits huddled closer to the fire as the wind picked up, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the medic who had turned healing into the perfect weapon of war. Commander Zethkar added more fuel to the plasma fire, the blue flames leaping higher and casting dancing shadows across the rocky ground of the alien moon. The 5 young recruits sat closer together now, their earlier excitement about hearing war stories replaced by something darker and more unsettling. The wind had died down, but the cold seemed to bite deeper into their bones. The second story I will tell you, the commander began, settling back onto his metal crate, takes place during what humans call the corporate wars of 2051. Different groups of humans were fighting for control of trade routes and mining rights. It was supposed to be a small conflict lasting only a few months. Kira's green skin had returned to its normal color, but her voice was still shaky from the previous tale. What made this war different, Commander? This story is about a human named Lisa Chen and her squad of 8 soldiers. They were ordered to defend a small military base called Firebase Echo. The base controlled a mountain pass that was important for moving supplies and troops. Zethkar's cybernetic eye glowed softly as he accessed his memory files. Lisa Chen was a sergeant, which means she was in charge of her small group. She was 26 years old, had been a soldier for 7 years, and was known for following orders exactly as they were given. Tess flexed her wings nervously. What were her orders? She was told to hold Firebase Echo for 24 hours. One day. Her commanders promised that reinforcements would arrive to relieve her squad before the enemy could mount a serious attack. It should have been a simple assignment. The old soldier paused, watching the faces of his young listeners. They were paying close attention now, learning to fear what came next in his stories. The enemy force that attacked Firebase Echo consisted of nearly 300 soldiers with heavy weapons and armored vehicles. Lisa Chen's squad had 8 people, including herself. They had basic weapons, some explosives, and whatever supplies were already at the base. Nom made a soft whimpering sound. 8 against 300? Commander, surely they retreated or surrendered. You still do not understand humans, Zethkar replied. Retreat was not mentioned in their orders. Surrender was not an option they considered. They had been told to hold the position for 24 hours, and that is exactly what they intended to do. He stood up and walked around the fire, his metal leg clicking against the stones. The first attack came 6 hours after Lisa Chen received her orders. The enemy expected to overwhelm the small base quickly, but they had not counted on human creativity. Jorak flexed his arms. What did they do? Private Danny Miller was an explosives expert. He had been trained to destroy enemy equipment and buildings, but Lisa Chen ordered him to use his skills differently. Instead of attacking the enemy directly, Miller began setting traps around the base. The commander's voice grew quieter, more intense. He buried explosive charges along the paths the enemy would use to approach, but these were not ordinary bombs. Miller designed them to wound rather than kill, to create fear rather than destruction. An explosion that would take off a foot but leave the victim alive and screaming. A blast that would blind an enemy soldier but allow him to call for help. Vex's 4 eyes blinked rapidly. Why would they want to wound instead of kill? Because, Zethkar explained, a dead soldier requires no resources from his army. But a wounded soldier needs medical care, needs other soldiers to carry him to safety, needs supplies and attention. Lisa Chen understood that wounded enemies were more valuable than dead ones. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance an alien patrol called out the all-clear signal. The normal sounds of the base continued around them, but they seemed muted and far away. The second part of their defense involved Corporal Alex Stone, their communications specialist. Instead of just calling for reinforcements, Stone began intercepting enemy radio transmissions. He learned their attack plans, their supply schedules, their patrol routes. Kira's skin shifted to a pale yellow. That sounds like standard military intelligence work. It was what Stone did with that information that made it remarkable, the commander continued. He began feeding false information back to the enemy. He would mimic their radio operators and give incorrect orders. He would report false positions for Lisa Chen's squad, causing enemy artillery to waste ammunition on empty ground. Zethkar sat back down, his movements deliberate and slow. But the most effective part of their defense was Private Maria Santos, their sniper. Santos had been trained to eliminate high-value targets from long range, but Lisa Chen gave her different orders. Nam leaned forward, despite his obvious fear. What kind of orders? Santos was told not to kill enemy officers or important targets. Instead, she was ordered to shoot enemy soldiers in ways that would cause maximum psychological damage. A shot through the knee that would cripple a man but leave him conscious and screaming. A bullet through the shoulder that would make it impossible to use a weapon, but would not cause immediate death. The recruits exchanged horrified glances. This type of warfare was beyond their understanding of honorable combat. By the end of the first day, Zethkar continued, the enemy had lost 30 soldiers killed and over 60 wounded. But more importantly, they had lost their confidence. Their commanders could not trust their radio communications. Their soldiers were afraid to advance because they did not know where the next trap would be waiting. Tess folded her wings tightly against her back. And the reinforcements? Did they arrive as promised? The commander's scarred face showed something that might have been admiration or horror. The reinforcements never came. Lisa Chen's commanders had been forced to retreat from their main positions. The promised relief force had been destroyed in another battle, hundreds of miles away. He let that information sink in before continuing. When Lisa Chen realized that no help was coming, she gathered her squad and told them the truth. They could retreat and try to escape, or they could continue following their orders to hold the position. Jorak's voice was barely above a whisper. What did they choose? All 8 of them voted to stay. They had been given orders to hold Firebase Echo, and they would hold it until those orders were changed, or until they were all dead. The wind picked up again, making the plasma fire flicker and sending sparks up into the dark sky above them. The recruits sat in stunned silence as they began to understand the implications of what they were hearing. What followed, Zethkar said, was 6 weeks of the most creative and terrifying defensive warfare ever recorded in human military history. Lisa Chen and her squad turned their small base into a fortress that became legend among human soldiers. He accessed more memory files, his cybernetic eye glowing brighter. Private Kevin Brown was their medic. Like Jake Murphy from my first story, Brown had extensive medical knowledge. But instead of using it to harm enemies, Brown used it to keep his own squad fighting long past the point where they should have collapsed. Kira made a soft sound of distress. What do you mean? Brown developed a system of combat medicine that allowed wounded soldiers to continue fighting. He would perform surgery under fire, using salvaged materials to repair injuries that should have ended a soldier's combat effectiveness. He created pain management techniques that would keep a person conscious and alert even with severe wounds. The commander stood up again, pacing around the fire. But the most remarkable thing was how they adapted their tactics as the weeks passed. Danny Miller began creating more sophisticated traps, using salvaged enemy equipment to build remote-controlled explosives. Alex Stone expanded his radio deception operations, eventually taking control of entire enemy communication networks. Nam shook his head in confusion. How could 8 soldiers hold off 300 for so long? Because they stopped thinking like 8 individual soldiers and started thinking like a single organism, dedicated to one purpose, Zethkar replied. They shared skills, shared knowledge, shared resources. Maria Santos taught the others advanced marksmanship. Danny Miller trained everyone in explosive techniques. Kevin Brown made sure they all knew basic medical procedures. The fire burned lower, and the commander added more fuel. By the 3rd week, the enemy was no longer trying to take Firebase Echo. They were trying to survive long enough to retreat from the area. Lisa Chen's squad had turned the surrounding terrain into a death trap that extended for miles in every direction. Tess spread her wings slightly, then folded them again. What happened to them? After 6 weeks, a relief force finally reached Firebase Echo. They found Lisa Chen still at her command post coordinating the defense. She had sustained 17 separate wounds during the siege. She had not slept for more than 2 hours at a time in 42 days. She had lost 30 pounds and was running on pure determination. The commander's voice grew very quiet. When the relief commander told her that she and her squad were being relieved and could stand down, Lisa Chen asked for written confirmation of the order. She wanted to make sure she was not abandoning her post without proper authorization. The recruits sat in complete silence, trying to process what they had heard. The idea of holding a position for 6 weeks when ordered to hold it for 1 day was beyond their comprehension. The plasma fire had burned low again, and Commander Zethkar added more fuel with his metal fingers. The blue flames jumped higher, casting long shadows across the faces of the 5 young recruits. They no longer looked eager to hear war stories. Instead, they huddled close together, their eyes wide with growing fear of what their human allies were truly capable of. The 3rd story, Zethkar began, his voice even quieter than before, happened in space, on a station orbiting one of Jupiter's moons. The year was 2063, and humans were fighting what they called the Titan Rebellion. Some human colonies had decided they no longer wanted to follow Earth's government. Vex shifted nervously, all 4 of his eyes focused on the commander. Space warfare, Commander? Like ship-to-ship combat? The old soldier shook his head slowly. No, young one. This story takes place entirely on one space station called Europa Station. It was home to 15,000 humans, both civilians and military personnel. The station was important because it controlled shipping routes to the outer colonies. Kira's green skin had turned a worried yellow color. Was there a great battle for the station? There was no battle at all, Zethkar replied. The rebels took control of Europa Station through sabotage and surprise attacks. They captured or killed almost everyone on the station in a single day. Almost everyone. He paused, letting his cybernetic eyes scan through old memory files. One person survived the initial attack. Her name was Beth Taylor, and she was a lieutenant commander in the human space navy. She was 29 years old and had spent most of her career working on space stations. Tess folded her wings tighter against the cold. What happened to her? When the rebels attacked, Beth Taylor was in the engineering section of the station, performing routine maintenance on the life support systems. She heard the fighting over the communication channels, heard her commander ordering all personnel to surrender or be killed. She heard the rebels take control of the command center. The wind picked up, making the fire flicker and sending sparks into the dark sky above them. Most humans in her situation would have tried to escape in a small ship or would have surrendered to save their own lives. Beth Taylor did neither of these things. Nom leaned forward despite his obvious fear. What did she do? She disappeared into the maintenance tunnels of the station. Europa Station was huge, with thousands of kilometers of service corridors, ventilation shafts, and access ways that were never meant for human habitation. Beth Taylor knew these spaces better than anyone else on the station. Zethkar stood up and walked around the fire, his metal leg clicking against the stones. For the first week, the rebels assumed she had died in the initial attack or had escaped in a small craft. They posted guards and patrols, but they were looking for external threats, not for one person hiding inside their own station. Jorak flexed his powerful arms nervously. Surely one person could not threaten hundreds of rebels. That, the commander said, is what the rebels thought too. They were wrong. He sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. Beth Taylor spent the first month learning everything about the rebels. She watched them through maintenance cameras, listened to their communications through service panels, studied their routines and their weaknesses. The recruits exchanged glances. This sounded like standard intelligence gathering, nothing particularly frightening. But what Taylor did with that information, Zethkar continued, was unlike anything any military strategist had ever attempted. She did not try to contact the outside for help. She did not attempt to sabotage critical systems. Instead, she began a campaign of psychological warfare that lasted 6 months. Kira's skin shifted to a deeper shade of yellow. Psychological warfare? Taylor understood that the rebels' greatest weakness was not their equipment or their numbers. It was their minds. Living on a space station requires trust in the technology that keeps you alive. You must trust the air recycling systems, the gravity generators, the hull integrity monitors. Taylor began to destroy that trust. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance they heard a human laugh from the base. The sound seemed somehow different now, less comforting than it had earlier in the evening. She started small, the commander explained. A ventilation fan that would stop working for exactly 1 hour, then start again. A light in a corridor that would flicker at random intervals. A door that would sometimes take 3 tries to open instead of 1. Vex blinked his 4 eyes rapidly. Those sound like minor technical problems. Exactly, Zethkar nodded. And that was the brilliance of Taylor's plan. Every space station has technical problems. Maintenance crews fix them as they occur. But the rebels had killed all the maintenance crews during their takeover. He accessed more memory files, his cybernetic eye glowing brighter. As weeks passed, the small problems became bigger problems. The air recycling system would occasionally produce strange smells that lasted for hours. The gravity in certain sections would fluctuate slightly, making people feel dizzy. The water recycling system would sometimes produce water that tasted metallic. Nam made a soft sound of understanding. They could not tell if these were normal technical problems or sabotage. Precisely. And because they had no trained maintenance personnel, they could not fix the problems even when they tried. Taylor would wait for them to attempt repairs, then would undo their work and create new problems in different areas. The wind died down, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant hum of the base's generators. The recruits sat in complete silence, beginning to understand the psychological terror Taylor had created. By the third month, Zethkar continued, the rebels were afraid to sleep. They would lie awake listening to every sound the station made, wondering if each noise meant that something critical was failing. They began to suspect each other of being saboteurs. Tess spread her wings slightly, then folded them again. But surely they tried to find her. They organized dozens of search parties. They sent teams into every maintenance tunnel, every storage compartment, every possible hiding place. But Europa Station was enormous, and Taylor knew it better than anyone. She could move through areas that the rebels did not even know existed. The commander's voice grew even quieter, and every time they searched for her, Taylor would be somewhere else creating new problems. She would reprogram the station's computer systems to give false readings on critical instruments. She would alter the environmental controls to make certain areas too hot or too cold. She would interfere with their communication systems so that orders would be garbled or delayed. Kira's skin had turned a deep purple, the color of extreme fear among her people. How long could she survive? Hiding in the maintenance areas? Taylor had access to emergency food supplies and water recycling equipment throughout the station. She had medical supplies from first aid stations. Most importantly, she had knowledge of how every system on the station worked. She could maintain her own life support while slowly destroying theirs. Zethkar stood up again, walking to the edge of the firelight. By the fourth month, the rebels were no longer trying to operate Europa Station as a military base. They were simply trying to survive. Their leaders began requesting evacuation ships from other rebel forces. Jorak's voice was shaky when he spoke. And Taylor? What was she doing during all this time? She was watching them break down. She was listening to their radio transmissions as they begged for help, as they reported ghost sightings and equipment failures that made no sense. She was studying their psychology, learning exactly which fears would be most effective. The old soldier turned back to face them. In the fifth month, Taylor began leaving evidence of her presence but never revealing herself. A rebel would wake up to find his personal belongings rearranged. Another would discover that someone had been in his quarters while he slept, but nothing would be missing. Nom shivered, not just from the cold. They knew someone was there, but they could not find her. The rebels began calling her the station ghost. They would whisper stories about her to each other, each tale more frightening than the last. Some claimed she could walk through walls. Others said she could control the station's computer systems with her thoughts. A few believed she was already dead, but her spirit continued to haunt them. The fire burned lower, and the shadows seemed to grow longer and darker. By the sixth month, the psychological pressure had become unbearable. The rebels were making mistakes, fighting among themselves, abandoning their posts. Their leaders had lost all control over their forces. Tess asked quietly, "How did it end?" Beth Taylor finally revealed herself by walking into the station's command center during a shift change. She was wearing her naval uniform, carrying no weapons, and completely calm. The rebels were so shocked to see an actual person instead of a ghost that they forgot to raise their weapons. Zethkar's cybernetic eye glowed as he accessed the final part of the record. Taylor announced that she was retaking control of Europa Station in the name of Earth's government. She ordered all rebels to surrender immediately or face the consequences. The recruits waited in tense silence for the conclusion. Every single rebel surrendered without a fight. The plasma fire had burned very low now, casting only a small circle of blue light against the vast darkness of the alien moon. Commander Zethkar added the last of his fuel to the flames, knowing that this would be his final story of the night. The 5 young recruits sat in complete silence, no longer the eager soldiers who had gathered around the fire hours earlier. They had learned to fear the humans who served as their allies, and that fear showed in their faces. The last story, I will tell you, Zethkar began, his voice barely above a whisper, is the most terrible of all. It happened during the Battle of New Cambria, on the colony world of Kepler 438b. This was the final battle of the Colonial Independence War, and everything depended on its outcome. Kira's green skin had remained a deep purple color for the past hour. Another human Civil War commander? Yes, but this one was different. By 2089, humans had spread to dozens of worlds throughout their local star systems. Some colonies wanted independence from Earth's government. The war had been going on for 3 years, and millions of humans had died on both sides. The old soldier's cybernetic eye glowed as he accessed the most disturbing files in his memory banks. The story centers on a human named Ray Johnson. He was a colonel in Earth's military, commanding the defense of New Canberra, the last major city still loyal to Earth's government. Vex blinked his 4 eyes nervously. How many soldiers did he command? Johnson had 8,000 soldiers under his command. The rebel forces attacking the city numbered over 80,000, with superior weapons and complete control of the space around the planet. By every military calculation, New Canberra should have fallen within days. Tess folded her wings so tightly against her back that they seemed to disappear. What made this battle different from the others you have told us about? Zethkar was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made the recruits lean closer, despite their fear. Johnson made a decision that no other species in the galaxy would even consider. He decided that winning the war was more important than remaining human. Nom made a soft sound of confusion. What do you mean, Commander? I mean that Johnson and his soldiers chose to transform themselves into something that was no longer entirely human. They used genetic modification, chemical enhancement, and surgical alteration to become perfect weapons of war. The wind had died completely, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant hum of machinery from the base. The recruits sat in horrified silence as they began to understand what they were about to hear. Johnson had a scientist on his staff named Dr. Paul Martinez. Martinez had been working on experimental treatments for battlefield injuries, ways to help wounded soldiers survive and continue fighting. But Johnson ordered him to go much further than medical treatment. Jorak's powerful arms trembled as he spoke. How much further? Martinez developed a process that would enhance human soldiers beyond the normal limits of their species, enhanced reflexes that were 10 times faster than natural human responses, muscle density that gave them strength far beyond what their bodies should have been able to handle, nervous system modifications that allowed them to ignore pain completely. Zethkar's metal fingers drummed against his leg as he continued. But the most terrifying enhancement was to their brain chemistry. Martinez found ways to eliminate fear, doubt, and hesitation. The modified soldiers could make tactical decisions with perfect clarity even while dying. They could watch their closest friends die without any emotional response that might interfere with their mission. Kira's skin had turned almost black, with terror. But, Commander, such modifications would change them completely. They would no longer be the same people. Exactly. The old soldier nodded. And that was the most frightening part of Johnson's plan. He did not force any of his soldiers to undergo the modifications. He explained exactly what the process would do to them, how it would change them permanently, how they would never be able to return to normal human life. The fire flickered lower, and the shadows seemed to press closer around their small circle of light. Then he asked for volunteers. Tess made a small whimpering sound. Surely no one would volunteer for such a thing. Every single soldier under Johnson's command volunteered. All 8,000 of them. They understood that the modifications would destroy their humanity, but they believed that saving their civilization was worth any personal sacrifice. Zethkar stood up slowly, his movements stiff with age and old injuries. The transformation process took 2 weeks. During that time, the rebel forces continued their advance toward New Canberra, expecting to find a city ready to surrender. He walked around the fire one last time, looking at each of the recruits. What they found instead was an army of creatures that had once been human, but were now something else entirely. Something that knew no fear, felt no pain, and would never stop fighting until either they or their enemies were completely destroyed. Nom's voice was barely audible. What happened in the battle? It was not a battle, Zethkar replied. It was a slaughter. Johnson's modified soldiers moved faster than normal humans could react. They ignored wounds that should have been fatal. They coordinated their attacks with inhuman precision. They felt no mercy for their enemies and expected none in return. The commander's cybernetic eye dimmed as he accessed the most disturbing parts of the historical record. The rebel forces outnumbered Johnson's army 10-1, but numbers meant nothing against opponents who could not be stopped by conventional weapons. A modified soldier could continue fighting even after losing limbs. They could function normally with injuries that would kill an unmodified human. Jorak asked quietly, "How long did the battle last?" 72 hours. At the end of those 3 days, the rebel army had been completely destroyed. Not defeated, not routed, but entirely eliminated. Johnson's modified soldiers had killed every enemy they encountered, pursuing them even when the rebels tried to retreat. The fire was burning very low now, barely providing enough light to see each other's faces. The recruits sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had heard. The rebels won the war, Zethkar continued. Other rebel forces heard about what had happened at New Canberra and refused to continue fighting. They surrendered unconditionally, demanding only that Johnson's modified soldiers be kept far away from their territories. Vex's 4 eyes were wide with horror. And Johnson? What happened to him and his soldiers? That is the most tragic part of the story, the old soldier said, sitting back down on his metal crate. The modifications were permanent. Johnson and his 8,000 soldiers could never return to normal human society. They had saved their civilization, but they were no longer part of it. Kira made a soft sound of distress. Where did they go? They were given ships and supplies and sent to explore the furthest reaches of human space. They became permanent exiles, too dangerous to live among normal humans, but too valuable to simply destroy. Some say they are still out there, exploring the galaxy. No longer fully human, but still serving their original mission to protect humanity. The wind picked up again, making the dying fire flicker and sending the last sparks up into the dark sky. The recruits huddled together, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had learned. "This is why I fear humans," Zethkar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because they are evil, but because they are capable of sacrificing anything, including their own humanity, to achieve victory. They will transform themselves into monsters if that is what victory requires." He looked at each of the young soldiers one final time. Johnson's soldiers were not forced to become inhuman weapons. They chose to do so because they believed their cause was worth any sacrifice. That level of dedication, that willingness to give up everything for victory, is what makes humans the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The fire died down to glowing embers, and the cold began to seep back into their bones. In the distance, they could still hear human voices from the base, laughing and talking as they prepared for sleep. "Remember these stories," the commander said as he prepared to leave. "Remember that our human allies chose to fight beside us instead of against us. Remember that their friendship is precious because their enmity would be absolutely terrifying." He stood up slowly, his cybernetic leg creaking in the cold. "And remember that somewhere out in the darkness of space, there may still be humans who sacrifice their humanity to save their species. They are our allies too, even though we may never meet them." Zethkar walked away into the darkness, leaving the 5 young recruits alone with the dying fire and their new understanding of what their human allies were truly capable of. They sat in silence for a long time, each wondering if they would ever be able to look at their human comrades the same way again. The cold wind of the alien moon swept across the base, carrying with it the sound of human laughter that no longer seemed quite as comforting as it had at the beginning of the night. The recruits finally stood up and walked back to their barracks. But none of them slept easily that night. They had learned that their human allies were capable of acts of kindness and generosity that warmed the heart.